Hi everyone, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to another section of Abralinha ao Vivo Linguists Online today, featuring Professor Ellen Bialystok. My name is Ingrid Finger, and I'm a professor and researcher on psycholinguistics and bilingualism at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. As you know, Abralinha ao Vivo Linguists Online is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association in a joint project with the Permanent International Committee of Linguists, the Latin American Association of Linguistics and Philology, the Argentinian Association for Linguistic Studies, the Spanish Association of Linguistics, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, the Australian Linguistic Society, and the British Association for Applied Linguistics. This event is designed to give students and researchers free access to state-of-the-art discussions on the most diverse topics related to the study of human language during this difficult quarantine period. Thank you, Miguel, and all the Abralinha team for organizing this wonderful series of events. Today, we have a very special guest, Professor Ellen Bialystok. I'm deeply honored to introduce her today. Dr. Bialystok's research on bilingualism from childhood through older adulthood and aging and its effects on cognitive processes over the lifespan tremendously influenced the academic history of many scholars in Brazil, including mine. Professor Ellen Bialystok is a distinguished research professor of psychology and Walter Gordon Research Chair of Lifespan Cognitive Development at York University, an associate scientist at the Rotman Research Institute of the Baycrest Center for Geriatric Care. She is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Her research uses behavior and neuroimaging methods to examine the effect of bilingualism on cognitive processes across the lifespan. Her discoveries include the identification of differences in the development of essential cognitive and language abilities for bilingual children, the use of different brain networks by monolingual and bilingual young adults performing simple conflict tasks, and the postponement of symptoms of dementia in bilingual older adults. Among her several awards are the Canadian Society for Brain Behavior and Cognitive Science Hebb Award, 2011, Killian Prize for the Social Sciences, 2010, York University President's Research Award of Merit, 2009, Donald Stuss Award for Research Excellence at the Baycrest Geriatric Center, 2005, Dean's Award for Outstanding Research, 2002, Killian Research Fellowship, 2000 and 2001. On June 30, 2016, Professor Bialystok was named an Officer of the Order of Canada by Governor General David Johnston for her contributions to our understanding of the cognitive benefits of bilingualism and for opening up new avenues of research in her field. In 2017, she was granted an honorary doctorate from the University of Oslo for her contributions to research. Professor Bialystok's talk today is entitled, Does Bilingualism Affect Cognitive and Brain Structures? Facts and Fictions. Professor Bialystok, we thank you immensely for joining us today. We're very pleased to have you here. And before we begin, let me remind everyone to post their questions on the chat during the talk. And now I turn this over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Ingrid, and thank you, Miguel, for inviting me. It's a great honor to be in this illustrious set of talks, and I thank you for that. Okay, so we're going to have a look at the question that's become a bit of a hot spot lately in some circles. Is there any evidence that bilingualism, just being bilingual in a normal way through your life, has an impact on either brain or cognitive structures? It's well known that both brain and cognition are constantly changing in response to the experiences we have, the skills we learn, the kinds of activities we engage in. This is called neuroplasticity. It's well documented and it's common. And in all the cases you can see here, These are activities that have been documented to lead to measurable changes in brain and or cognitive structures. Well, bilingualism is an intense experience. Can it also lead to neuroplastic changes? Well, why would it? Why would we even consider bilingualism to be a candidate for such changes? Language use is possibly the most intense, most sustained, and most time-consuming activity we engage in. It recruits networks from all across the brain, as well as multiple cognitive systems. So it's really using your brain in complete ways. Well, how would it work? We know now from a very large body of psycholinguistic research that for a bilingual, both language systems are always active to some degree. There's no language switch. It never goes away. And if the two languages are always active, and at least part of your time is spent in a context where the people around you will only understand one of them, that means there's a constant need for selection. So we have this jointly activated dual system and a need to be focusing in quite precisely on the language we need in the context of joint activation. If that's the case, what are the consequences? And what I will argue is that the primary consequence is that this lifelong engagement in selection, in focus, leads to an adaptation, a reorganization in the general attention networks in our minds and brains. So the conclusion will be that bilingualism leads to an adaptation in attention systems that can be traced directly to the use of languages in these ways. Now, a lot of research has been conducted in the last 20 years over the question about whether or not such changes or modifications in language, in cognitive and brain systems can be traced to bilingual experience. And what I'm showing on this slide is sort of the lay of the land. So research has shown across the lifespan, infancy to older adulthood, using behavioral and imaging methods, and a great variety of methods and specific research questions, evidence that monolinguals and bilinguals in each of these age groups and broad methodological categories differ in their response, their cognitive ability, their brain structure, or other sorts of measures. That's a very broad base of evidence. But not all experiments give the same results. This is true for any field. So what we find is that although there's a large body of research, there's also a lot of inconsistency in some of the research. As you may know, there's been recently a lot of discussion about whether we can believe any of these claims that bilingualism, in fact, leads to such modifications. And interestingly, I think, despite the fact that the research covers the whole map that I'm showing you now, the vast majority of the controversy focuses on one piece of the argument. And that is young adults performing executive function tasks under conditions where accuracy and reaction time are recorded. That is the primary source of controversy. So we need to look at that because it is a real disparity in outcomes that are primarily concentrated on that cell. I'm going to show you one study that lays out what I'm talking about. This study used a Simon task. In this task, participants see either red squares or green squares on a monitor. The squares appear either on the left or the right side of the monitor. And they're given a simple rule. If you see a red square, press the left button. If you see a green square, press the right button. And because everything is all randomly presented, half of the trials mean a red square is on the left. That's easy because everything lines up. But half the time it's on the right. And that's harder because there's now a conflict between the position of the stimulus and the position of the hand you need to press the button. It's a well-documented phenomenon. So that's the kind of phenomenon that's captured by executive function tasks. Typically, there's a conflict. You have to resolve the conflict. Often there are congruent and incongruent trials. And the better you are able to resolve that inherent conflict, the better we say your executive function ability. All right, so that's the task. We gave this task to participants at all ages. So children, for example, and what I'm going to show you is reaction time to congruent and incongruent trials. Here's the results for children. Monolinguals are in red, bilinguals are in blue. That is the color scheme for the whole presentation. So you can see that the bilinguals are faster, shorter reaction time. Middle-aged adults, again, the bilinguals are faster. Older adults, again, the bilinguals are faster. Younger adults, absolutely no difference. Completely identical results. So what we found, we published this paper in 2005, and what we said at the time is, well, the bilinguals indeed perform this task better than monolinguals in 3 of the age groups. There was no difference in the younger adults, and that didn't seem to be a problem. Now that finding, showing no difference in young adults on a simple task like this, has been replicated many times. And several meta-analyses have also scooped up lots of these studies and shown that's what mostly happens. But curiously, 8 years after we published that, another paper was published that seemed to be very bothered by that result. So this is a study by Papp and Greenberg published in 2013. They gave this plus similar tasks to groups of young adults who were monolingual or bilingual and recorded their reaction time. What did they find? I'm going to show you their results on the same graph. Okay, they're identical. They're completely identical. I'll show you, there it is again. So it's a replication. Except that's not how it was interpreted. It was interpreted as contradictory evidence and was used as the starting point of challenging all of the claims that had been made up to this point about the bilingual effects on cognition. Now, it is a reliable finding that for young adults, there's often no difference. But what does it mean? How do we explain the range of contradictory effects? Why do we find differences in some groups, on some tasks, in some situations, but not others? That all needs an explanation. To start, I want to have a look at how these effects have been traditionally explained. Now, the assumption from the earliest studies 20 years ago showing cognitive differences on some tasks between monolinguals and bilinguals was that these tasks were capturing differences in executive function ability. Well, what does that mean? Nobody really knew 20 years ago, but around that time, a very influential model that set out a way of thinking about executive function was published. And that was the unity and diversity model proposed by Miyake and his colleagues. This model was very timely because it was precisely at the point where evidence about language group differences on some kinds of tasks was starting to emerge. It seemed to have something to do with executive function, but not clear what. And there was no really coherent way of thinking about what executive functioning was. So the model was very timely, and it came to frame the vast majority of the research conducted in the past 20 years. So here's the model. Miyake and colleagues proposed that executive function can be thought of as consisting of 3 components. Here they're called updating, shifting, and inhibition. In later revisions of the model, that moves around a little bit. It doesn't matter. What remains constant is that it's a structuralist model with components that capture the variance in an aspect of executive functioning. Within each of the components, there are several tasks, typically 3 in his model and in the revisions. And the idea is that performance on these tasks all reflect the functioning of that component, and that there's an integrity to the component that has both a correlation with the other components, but more importantly, an independence from it. So unity and diversity. Here's the logic. Let's say you give a group of monolingual and bilingual participants one of these tasks, and the way I have this slide laid out, it's a Stroop task. It could be any of them, but this is just for example. So you give a Stroop task to monolingual and bilingual participants, and you find better bilingual performance. And I'm deliberately using that awkward terminology because that's all we can say. We can't say any beyond what we observe. There's better bilingual performance on that task. Great. But this is a theoretical prediction generated by a model. So we have to say, what does the model say about it? Well, the model says Stroop indexes inhibition. It's right there. Therefore, bilinguals have better inhibition. And if that's the case, bilinguals should have better inhibition on all tasks classified by this model as inhibition because they are all coherently reflecting that component. That's simply a description of the model stated in terms that make empirical predictions. It doesn't go beyond anything claimed in the original statement of the model. So that's how you would proceed to investigate the possibility that there are bilingual effects on cognition if your starting point would be the unity and diversity model. Very clear predictions. So how does that work out? Well, there were lots of problems, and there have been lots of problems in all of this research in the 20 years this model's been around. Very hard to get those predicted correlations between tasks within a component. Stroop doesn't particularly correlate with flanker. Even within a task, if it's an inhibition task, then it's reflecting inhibition according to that model. You don't need inhibition to solve a congruent trial. If the rule says press the left key and the stimulus is on the left, you don't need to inhibit anything. You would under this view if the stimulus was presented on the right. And yet, across a very large range of studies, congruent and incongruent trials are handled the same. So I'm going to just flash up 4 graphs quickly because I'm showing data from children, adolescents, young adults, older adults. I've just chosen examples from my own lab, but there are many, many, many of these results in the literature. And what you can see, again, monolinguals are red on both congruent and incongruent trials. The monolinguals are always slower. there is nothing special about the one condition that should be privileged if indeed inhibition is the relevant process. So bilinguals are faster on incongruent trials that require inhibition. Equally, they are faster on congruent trials that do not. So it can't be about inhibition. There's also lots of problems with how these assignments are made. I want to go very quickly through this point. Under the inhibition component, there's a conflation of two kinds of inhibition. One is the inhibition to execute a response. You're about to press that key and something in the task requires that you refrain from making the response. That's inhibition in the standard sense of the meaning. You inhibit the response, and that is called response inhibition. The second is the kind I was talking about a minute ago. You need to press the left key. The stimulus is on the right. You need to inhibit attending to the right. That's interference. Something is interfering with pressing the right key. Interference suppression. This is a distinction made in 2002 by Sylvia Bunge and her colleagues, and they demonstrated this distinction with developmental data, with fMRI data, and it's led to a very important discussion about what is different about these two kinds of inhibition. In bilingual research, there's a number of studies that show that tasks that are based on response inhibition, just don't press that key, are performed equivalently by monolinguals and bilinguals, whereas the interference suppression variety, which is what we have in Stroop, Simon, and Flanker tasks, is typically performed better by bilinguals. So there's no group differences in one, there are often group differences in the other, and yet these are taken as equal representations of inhibition in that componential model. And finally, as I've already mentioned, or at least alluded to, in about half the studies, there's no group difference at all, even though all of the studies follow that same logic. So that's a problem. These predictions follow directly from the logic of the model, but the predictions are often not supported. So you only have two choices. Either the predictions are wrong, the model is right, the predictions are wrong, there just is no cognitive effect of bilingualism. Or the model is wrong. Those are the only options. So let's revisit that model. Here it is again. And as I've been saying, there is a questionable, at best, relation among the tasks, both within a component and across components. All of those relationships are problematic if we take the predictions from the model seriously. So let's get rid of the components. Now what we have is tasks. Starting again, let's build from the bottom. We have a set of tasks. These tasks all measure in some way or another something about executive function. And if we look at them, what's common is they all require attention. That's a vague term. I'll try to be more clear as we go. But something about focusing, selecting, changing, it's where our attention is placed that's responsible for our performance on these tasks. So, as an alternative, let us begin by saying perhaps the effect of bilingualism is in the processes that modulate attention. Is there any evidence? So I've thrown away the components, and I'm going to revisit some studies using various kinds of tasks to see if there's evidence that attention could be the common thread. So you're going to see some quite different tasks here. I'm going to show you 4 or 5 different examples, starting with infants. Now, I think this is one of the most interesting and possibly exciting areas of study for bilingualism. In the early days, the assumption is bilingualism is a language experience. Something about speaking 2 languages changes our language experience. And if there's cognitive or non-linguistic consequences, it's because you've been speaking 2 languages. Makes perfect sense. So infants don't speak. Why would you even look for effects of bilingualism in infants? They don't say anything. Well, attention does begin at the moment of birth, and the development of attention is one of the most profound and important developments in childhood and beyond, and it's key to the development of executive functioning. So bilingual infants, which is to say infants who happen to be born into a bilingual environment, are, without ever asking, placed in a situation where the environment is more linguistically complex. Now, we know in remarkable research that from the beginning, almost from the moment of birth, neonate infants can distinguish between languages they heard in utero and languages that are new. They can tell the difference. And in the first 6 months of life, infants who are in a bilingual environment are making different responses to language. They can tell languages apart. They attend differently to the face of a speaker because they know where the more valuable linguistic information can be found. So even in the first 6 months of life, being in an environment where there's more than one language has alerted infants to a complexity that they are adjusting to and responding to in very appropriate ways. So do these responses to linguistic environments translate to non-linguistic responses? Is there something about the way these infants pay attention to language that shows up in the way they pay attention to non-linguistic stimuli? And there are a couple of studies, but I'm just going to show you the results from one that we did. We tested infants who were 6 months old. We had 20 per group. This is very difficult research. You have to go through a lot of infants to get the ones who can actually stay focused. They're in a little crib. They look up at this LED monitor. There's an eye tracker through a mirror. They're very happy. They're comfortable. And we show them this amazing task. They see either a target or a checkerboard in the center. And then following that cue, an incredible dancing star that they think is fantastic shows up either on the left or right side of the screen. And they love that star. They just want to see it. So they have to learn that if they see a checkerboard, the star will be in this position. If it's a target, it will be here. And because they're so motivated to see this reward, they learn where to look before the target even appears. So in this phase of the experiment, these bars show the percentage of time they correctly look to the position that the star is going to appear before it appears. So monolingual and bilingual infants are equally good at this. They're well above chance. They can learn it. And if you've seen a 6-month recently, I think you'll agree with me, that's remarkable. This is really hard. So they learn the association between the cue and the target. And they're equally fast. This is how long it takes them for their eye movement to land in the right place. So after a bunch of time doing that, we switch things around, and now they have to unlearn everything they've learned, because each cue is now going to be predicting the opposite position. Can they do it? Well, only the bilingual infants can do it. The monolingual infants are a chance. They're just looking around, trying to figure out where to find that star. But the bilingual infants are reliably above chance. How long does it take them to land on the correct spot? Now, the bilingual infants are just as fast as they were before. They figured it out. They got it. All right, you want me to look in the opposite place? I'll do it. That amazing dancing star, it's worth it. The monolingual infants, they are kind of looking around. They don't get it. So, at 6 months old, the bilingual infants are able to learn a new association and control attention better than the monolingual infants. Here's a different example. This is an effect called sequential congruency. So as I've said several times, if you give these tasks to young adults who are monolingual and bilingual, they'll generally perform them similarly. RT and accuracy will be the same. So what we're going to argue here is that these tasks may be, these analyses may be lacking sensitivity. We gave flanker tasks with my former postdoc, John Grundy. Gave a flanker task to young adults. There's actually 3 studies in this paper. The data are identical in all 3 studies. So I'm just showing you the results from one of the 3. Flanker task, young adults, monolingual and bilingual, congruent and incongruent trials. They're exactly the same as you've seen before. But the task is actually a bit more complex, because you get this random sequence of congruent, incongruent, 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 congruent. And the difficulty of each trial depends on what preceded it. So if the 2 consecutive trials are the same, congruent, congruent, it's easier. Oh, yeah. And if they are different, it's harder. And that analysis of the sequence of trials, looking for the response shifts, is called a sequential congruency effect. So we want to compare how monolinguals and bilinguals deal with these swaps, these shifts. This is just a picture, probably way too much information for this purpose, but only to say that this is a congruent trial followed by an incongruent trial. So you can see the RT goes way up. This is an incongruent trial followed by a congruent trial. It goes up again, but not quite as much. A sequential congruency effect gauges the ability of the participant to move on. It doesn't matter what you just did. Do the present trial. Don't be influenced. You want a small influence. You want to say, then was then, let me just do the current trial. And so what we have in those 3 experiments is that in all cases, and this is just 2 conditions in one of them, the monolinguals have a larger congruency effect. That is, it's more difficult for them to just move on and ignore what they just did. So this is called disengagement. The monolinguals require more time to switch attention, to disengage what they were doing and just move on. And despite overall reaction times that are comparable for the 2 groups, that disengagement of attention piece is better for bilinguals. And the next example is a different way of looking at those reaction times. Reaction time data are always skewed. You get a big bump and then it kind of tails off as longer and longer reaction times are required for some participants. And if you look at that distribution, it's possible to separate out the information pertaining to the overall how long does it take you to do this trial and how focused and attentive you are on that trial. So this is the difference between the overall mean time and the attention to the trial. Inhibition is related overall, I guess, to the mean time. The analysis used to do this is Gaussian, exponential Gaussian. The X takes the exponential part of the distribution. The Gaussian takes the mean of the distribution, separates them into two parameters. And the two parameters are called inhibition, which is related to overall how long it takes you to do the trial. It predicts the mean time to respond. And the attention component called tau, which reflects focus on the goal. And the more focused you are on the goal, the more attentive, selective, and focused you are, the smaller tau. So mu reflects the mean reaction time, tau reflects the attention. There's about 4 or 5 studies in the literature that have used Gaussian analyses on reaction time data for monolinguals and bilinguals performing these executive function tasks. And pretty well they all show the same thing. So I'm just going to show you the results of this one study where there were monolingual and bilingual young adults who performed the big 3 EF tasks, Stroop, Simon, and Flanker. And as often the case, if you look at the overall reaction time, there's no group difference. Now this is Zhu and Krotz study. Let's look at what happens when they separate now the components of that reaction time distribution into mu and tau. The first graph is mu. There's the Flanker task, the Stroop task, and the Simon task. Congruent and incongruent, congruent and incongruent, congruent and incongruent. And in their graphs, because it's from their paper, so I don't have my red and yellow, red and blue coding scheme, monolinguals are filled bars, bilinguals are empty bars, and you can see there is absolutely no difference. It takes them the same amount of time, something we knew from the overall RT. Here are the results for tau, focus of attention. Now remember, the more focused, the smaller the tau. The same 3 tasks, incongruent and incongruent trials, and in every single case, the bilinguals have a smaller tau. And I'll point out again, as we saw from reaction time data, this applies equally to congruent and incongruent trials. For the final example, I'm going to take a diversion back to language. I've focused so far on the use of attentional control in nonverbal tasks that are typically classified as executive function tasks. When we look to linguistic processing, it's typically the case that monolinguals perform better than bilinguals. This is across the board. Just using simple vocabulary scores as a measure, we find that across, and here we have over 3,000 participants included in these data, these are English standard scores for monolinguals in red and bilinguals in blue, showing that on average, bilinguals who speak English plus something else have an overall, on average, smaller English vocabulary. These are standard effects. On linguistic tasks, monolinguals do better. So what if we combine these polls? So we have the linguistic benefit for monolinguals, the executive function benefit for bilinguals, and try to find a task where maybe you need both. Consider linguistic tasks that require attention. And here's what we came up with. The DRM false memory paradigm. It goes like this. You're shown a list of words to study. Candy, sour, sugar, bitter. You learn these words and then you're tested on a new set of words, some of which were on the list. Sugar, it was on the list. Some of which was not on the list and has nothing to do with the list, flag. Candy was also on the list. But crucially, a word that was not on the list, sweet, but is related to the words that were on the list. So you learn a set of semantically related words, and then you're shown a new set of words, and for each word you have to decide if it was on the list or was not on the list. And the important condition is what happens when a semantically related word shows up that was not on the list. So to recognize that this semantically related word was not on the list, you need a lot of control of attention. You need not only to remember the words that were there, but realize that this related word that was activated along with all those others was not. So there are two studies here. The study one was with young adults. This was in collaboration with colleagues at WashU, Avanti Day and Mitch Summers, and my student, Margot Sullivan. So in the WashU portion of the study, this is the ability of young adults to correctly decide if a studied word like sugar or candy or flag was on the list or not. And they're all pretty good at it, and there's no difference between groups. But how often do they say that sweet was on the list? Well, sweet was not on the list, but what we see here is monolinguals are more likely, in fact, 60% of the responses to sweet were that it was on the list. Fewer such false alarms by bilinguals. This study was replicated in my lab using a new group of young adults and a group of older adults, and the results were exactly the same. No difference in recognizing studied words, a significant language group difference in falsely believing that the lure word was also on the list. So even linguistic tasks requiring selection and attention produce results that are similar to nonverbal tasks. So why is there controversy? There are many positive effects of bilingualism, but the pattern is absolutely not consistent, and it's certainly not consistent with the predictions made from that componential model. So how do you choose? You have some studies that show one thing. Bilinguals do better on these tasks than monolinguals. And equally, you have another group of studies that say, no, they don't. There's no difference. How do you choose? So let's look at making that decision. Here are three possible reasons to reject the positive results. So these are people who support the null position, who want to say, actually, we don't have to, here are problems with the studies that show positive results. And I've only taken 3. These are recurring arguments in the literature for reasons that we should not accept the positive results. The first one is that bilingualism is confounded with other things, so that when there are positive effects of bilingualism, it's not because they're bilingual, it's because of something else. And the something else can be socioeconomic status, immigration patterns, intelligence, all sorts of stuff. But let's just take socioeconomic status. So the positive effects of bilingualism found in these studies are reflecting the unfortunate fact that bilingualism is confounded with SES in the design, and so these are really SES effects. Well, it is absolutely true that SES is possibly the single most important predictor of executive functioning in children. So, in a study of over 18,000 children, Hartanto and her colleagues looked at the range of SES from very low to very high, and with 18,000 children, there's going to be a big range. And these executive function scores that have been reduced to the standard scale over a number of tasks. So how did monolingual and bilingual children do? 2 things to notice about the results. Look first at monolingual children. I just said that SES is the most important predictor of EF by far. And if you look at the monolingual children, you can see very clearly that as SES increases, so does the executive function score. Look at the bilingual children. Not only are they always doing better than the monolingual children, but they're especially profiting in the more at-risk groups. So if SES isn't there to support their development of EF functioning, it seems that bilingualism kicks in. So this is an interaction effect where bilingualism is always helpful, but it's especially helpful for children at risk. Second example, this is a study of cortical volume in the development of cortical volume in childhood. Again, strongly related to SES and very important for executive functioning and all kinds of success. This is a study of over 500 children by Brito and Noble. These bars show cortical volume, and again, bilinguals are in blue. So you want a lot of cortical volume. If we first look at high SES kids, it doesn't matter if you're monolingual or bilingual, you're in a stimulating home environment, your brain is developing just fine. But if you're in a low SES environment, the monolingual data is reflecting what is typically found in this literature, and there is a very profound deficiency in cortical development, but not for the bilinguals. So yet again, bilingualism is boosting brain development in the most at-risk groups. So is it some confound like SES? There are many, many studies. I've just chosen those 2. Many studies have deconflated these experiences and shown there is no confound. Some have argued it's publication bias. If you have positive results, you're likely to get published. If you have no results, you're not. Well, without going into that argument, even if it's true, the only thing publication bias affects is the ratio of positive and negative results or null results. It doesn't challenge the validity of the positive results that are published. It just says maybe there's too many of them. It's a ratio. It's not a validity check. And finally, some have argued that sample size is crucial. If you have a large enough sample, then you'll see the truth emerge, and the truth is that there's no effect. Well, I just showed you data from a study of 18,000 children, and those results were pretty clear. All right, so those are the reasons that have been proposed to reject positive results. What about reasons to reject null results? And here I'm going to start with what I think is the most important of all of them, and that is, what do you mean by bilingual anyway? How do you define bilingual? This is becoming a very salient topic in research on bilingualism. So it is unlike every other independent variable that I'm aware of in psychology. You compare 5-year-olds to 8-year-olds, you know what group you're in. You compare younger adults to older adults, you know what group you're in. How do you define bilingual? Because it's not categorical, it's a continuum. And the full range of experiences across this incredibly complex, rich experience defines positions that we ultimately have to classify if we're going to make this research tractable. There are now a number of studies, and this is a new way of looking at this research, but there's already a good number of studies that have shown that if we take this continuum approach and relate outcomes not to categorical differences between groups, but to where individuals lie on this full continuum, we can find much more nuanced results where the degree or type of bilingualism is related to the degree of outcome. This is a study that we published where we looked at performance on a flanker task with a measure of how bilingual individuals were. And here a smaller effect is better performance. And what we found is a significant correlation, a regression, so that the more bilingual individuals were, the better they did on the task. This is a study I was involved with colleagues at Rennes University. First author is Vince DeLuca. And here he looked at how long people had been immersed in a bilingual environment. And this is now a measure of brain structure where a larger score is better. And the longer they have been immersed in the environment, the better their brain outcomes. This is a study by my student Ashley Chung-Fat Yim, who looked at the relation between degree of bilingualism and the speed, the RT on a flanker task, and the more bilingual they were, the faster they did the task. Here's the first study of its type that I know. This is 2008. Gigi Look, who was my student at the time, did this study where she classified 140 young adult bilinguals according to basically how bilingual they were, looking at how proficient they were in both languages and how much they used both languages, and then how well they did on some executive function tasks, and included a group of monolinguals. So there were non-conflict tasks. These shades of blue are the shades of bilingualism, with the darkest blue being the most bilingual, and the monolinguals, there's no difference at all. But on conflict tasks, there's a significant difference in which RT increases most for the monolinguals. It's significantly different than the increase for the bilinguals. And the three kind of bilingual groups, They're all in the middle, and they're not significantly different from each other, and they're not significantly different from the monolinguals. So if your study included sort of bilinguals and monolinguals, what these data tell you is don't expect a difference. It depends on how bilingual you are. And a more recent example by Gigi Look, where she and her colleagues looked at a large number of preschool children and their accuracy on some measures here. This is a really interesting curve showing how much they're using the non-English language at home, indicating that there's a sweet spot. So kids who are using it kind of 60 to 80% of the time are in fact the most bilingual in that sense, because they're using English otherwise. So these are complex nonlinear relations between degree of bilingualism and what we can expect to happen both behaviorally and to the brain. So let's look now at reasons to reject the null results. First, because unless we know a lot about the details of the bilingual experience, we don't know how to interpret the outcomes. And typically, the studies reporting null results don't give us that information. We also know that the type of task matters and the context matters. And here, I don't have time to talk about it, but I will just point you to a really important model, the adaptive control model, worked out by David Green and Jubin Abudalabi, that takes the details of how languages are used in contexts. Do you use two languages all the time? Does everybody in that environment speak both? Is it okay if you switch? And uses these details to predict the effects on both brain and behavior as a result of that type of bilingual experience. All right, so why does it matter? Is this just nitpicking and trying to see who's right for no particular reason than winning? No, it matters a lot because executive functioning is central to all cognitive processing. In childhood, it's related to cognitive development, academic achievement, long-term health and well-being. These are big outcomes. It's associated with what's called in the developmental literature, resilience. Children build up resilience in lockstep with how they're building up these abilities to focus, plan, concentrate, and avoid distracting interference. But I'm going to argue that the real importance, the biggest payoff, is in older age. Because no matter how healthy we are, how active we are, how stimulated we are, there is normal, healthy, natural decline of cognitive function with aging. But we're not all that healthy. Some of us age and encounter significant challenges. And as cognitive declines naturally, some people also experience clinical cognitive decline that leads to dementia. There is no effective pharmacological treatment for dementia. There is no brain pill that works, no matter what you see on television. It doesn't exist. So the only resource to try to hold back cognitive decline, both the normal, healthy, natural kind and the clinical kind, is through building up cognitive reserve through lifestyle activities. So cognitive reserve is the idea that you can sustain high levels of cognitive functioning through continued use. Here's what it looks like. The signature of cognitive reserve is a dissociation between what's happening in your brain and what's happening in your mind, what's happening in the cognitive systems. So typically, brain, drawn as the blue line, and cognitive level, drawn as the green line, decline with age, and they decline in lockstep. Cognitive reserve is the notion that as the brain structure atrophies with normal aging, the cognitive level doesn't have to. So what we're going to look at here is the idea, the possibility that bilingualism can contribute to cognitive reserve and keep that green line, the cognitive line, high. Now, in studies that look at cognitive function and indeed executive function performance in older monolingual and bilingual populations, find either that the two groups are similar or sometimes that the bilinguals are higher. But that doesn't tell the whole story, because if you look at the brains, and remember, we have two lines that we have to consider. What we find in a series of studies now is that as the cognitive level for bilinguals stays at the same level as monolinguals, if you look at their brains, there's more deterioration in the bilingual brains. So with a more deteriorated brain, the bilinguals are able to perform at a higher level of function. Let me insert, bilingualism does not make your brain deteriorate. What's going on here is that these studies only include participants whose cognitive level is normal. So if monolinguals had brains that deteriorated to the same extent as bilinguals, their cognitive levels would have deteriorated as well, and they wouldn't be in the study. So we're looking at a case where monolinguals and bilinguals matched for cognitive level. We often find that the bilinguals are dealing with more deterioration. One way to see this is when symptoms of dementia appear. There are standard clinical criteria for diagnosing dementia that are used globally. And there are now a large number of studies conducted around the world, and we can extract from them the age at which dementia was diagnosed to monolingual and bilingual patients. Because these criteria, diagnostic criteria, are common, we know that all of these participants present to the clinic with the same level of symptoms, with the same cognitive level. But what we see is that in study after study, the bilinguals are older. So they've been hanging around longer before it becomes apparent that there's a problem. Well, if we can look in their brains, there's several ways of doing this, but I've only chosen one because there's two examples of this point. Let's look at how their brains are functioning. So now we're going to take monolingual and bilingual patients with either mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease. They're matched on clinical level. They present identically. They seem to be suffering from exactly the same amount of disease. Metabolic glucose uptake begins to break down as dementia builds up. So if we can compare the glucose metabolism in these patients, we will have a window into how much disease they're dealing with, how much pathology they're coping with. In the first study, we have monolingual and bilingual patients matched as perfectly as possible, and we look at their glucose uptake. The bilinguals have greater glucose impairment. significant reduction of glucose metabolism in the bilinguals. So they present the same, but the bilinguals have more disease. And I chose this measure because there's a second study that replicates the results. In the second study, this second study is from Italy. We have a slightly larger group. And again, what is their glucose metabolism? The bilinguals are more impaired, Pirani and colleagues. So what we have here is that when the symptomology for dementia is identical, the bilinguals are much farther along on the disease track. That is exactly what we mean by cognitive reserve. Their cognitive level, it's not perfect. They've been diagnosed with dementia, but it is higher than predicted by their brain state. That's cognitive reserve. Well, that's interesting that just speaking languages can hold off symptoms of dementia. Does this mean that more bilingual countries have less dementia? I used to be asked that question a lot. And I'd say, how could you ever possibly know? Countries are different. They have different health systems. Everything is different. You couldn't ever possibly investigate that idea until it was investigated in a study a few years ago by Klein and colleagues. So they selected 95 countries where the language use patterns are quite different, where they could make judgments about population level bilingualism, something that's rarely done. It's hard to do. So they took these 95 countries and made judgments about population level bilingualism, and then compared the incidence of Alzheimer's disease in those countries as a function of population level bilingualism. So they classified the countries by the mean number of languages spoken. Now there's a very important caveat here. As I said, how could you ever compare countries? Everything is different. Alzheimer's disease is a disease of aging. You have to live long enough to get it. So a crucial difference between countries is life expectancy, which is related to all sorts of things, wealth, health systems, education. But if you can't control for life expectancy, you can't really say anything about Alzheimer's disease because you have to live long enough to develop it. But if you could do that, then countries with a higher life expectancy, that is a lot of people who live long enough to get Alzheimer's disease, they shouldn't be getting it if they're speaking a lot of languages. That's the prediction. Here are the very complicated results. It's a difficult graph, and so I'm going to take you through it bit by bit. Along the bottom are the mean number of languages, but if you take all the 95 countries, then the vast majority of them, 90% of them, fall into the 1 versus 2 categories. Only 10% of them have 3, 4, or 5 languages as the mean number of languages. So I have to say that these data are, beyond 3 are noise. There aren't enough data points. So just look at 1 versus 2. The next thing to look at is life expectancy. The black line is countries with low life expectancy. And I should have mentioned the y-axis is the AD incidence per 100,000 population. So it's all adjusted for population. What is the incidence of Alzheimer's disease adjusted for population? If the country has a low life expectancy, it doesn't matter how many languages you speak, and the incidence is really low, nobody's getting Alzheimer's disease. What about a medium life expectancy? That's the red line. So we see here that in the more monolingual countries, I don't know why this didn't quite extend. In the more monolingual countries, the incidence is higher than in the more bilingual countries. Whoops, there. But look at the countries where there's a lot of data, a high life expectancy. So everybody's living long enough to get Alzheimer's disease. And now we see this very substantial difference between countries in which people essentially speak one language and countries in which the population bilingualism is much higher. So there's a lower incidence of Alzheimer's disease in countries that are more bilingual. So let's go back then to the mechanism. This is the last argument I'm going to make. What's causing these effects? This is the slide I showed you earlier that lays out the logic that follows if you're using that componential model of executive function. And the mechanism that is under that whole logical argument is transfer. There's a transfer both within and across components. But you also saw that the predictions from that model didn't work so well. So let's look at that again. Here's what transfer is. You learn a skill in one context and apply it to another context. So the better the skill is in the first context, the better it will be in the second context. You learn to inhibit an interfering language term and you apply it so that you can inhibit the name of the word or the direction of the arrow or something on an executive function task. Those predictions were not very successful. So as an alternative, consider adaptation. It's a different process. You still have two skills, but they're both motivated by an underlying process. So some underlying general process is influencing performance on two skills. So let's say these skills are language selection and nonverbal selection, and the underlying process is selective attention. I've been arguing that bilingual experience modifies selective attention. Just being in a bilingual environment from birth changes the development and coordination of attention throughout the system. So if selective attention is modulated, that means everything controlled by selective attention is also affected. So by changing this underlying domain general attention network, we can then impact both language selection and nonverbal selection in different ways, independently, to different degrees, without requiring this transfer that implies a kind of a correlation between the skills, which need have nothing to do with each other. They're reflecting a common underlying system that has been adapted. And that's what I mean by neuroplasticity. It's the experience-dependent adaptation of processes that we see on a range of functions. Now, let's return to that map that showed the range of research that's taken on this question about whether or not bilingualism affects cognitive and brain systems. And as I said, there's results all over the place here. Sometimes the results are positive, sometimes they show no difference. If we're going to look at transfer as the explanation, and in particular transfer as it relates to that componential model, we might say it should predict what we see going on in these cases where children or young adults are performing these simple executive function tasks. However, that framework and that mechanism cannot possibly explain what happens with infants, older adults, and something that I really haven't talked about, brain structure. There's no transfer when infants in bilingual environments are able to change the rule and look in the new place to see the bouncing star. There's no transfer when older adults with increasing pathology building up in their brains are able to maintain normal levels of cognitive function. And there's certainly no transfer when brain structures and network functions discriminate between monolingual and bilingual brains. So the evidence from infants' cognitive reserve and brain outcomes cannot be explained by transfer. So my alternative is that it's something else. So we come back to the first question, does bilingualism affect cognitive and brain structures? Well, we saw lots of cases where it does. And these cases, although they are consistent and coherent and reliable, do not conform to the predictions made by the model, the framework we've been using for the last 20 years. We've been looking in the wrong place. So my concluding cautionary statement and hope for the future is that we change where we look. I think what's happening is that bilingual experience reconfigures attention networks in the brain from birth, just from the presence of a more stimulating, more complex linguistic environment. The earliest development of attention networks in the brain is modified. And this means that bilingualism is indeed a source of neuroplasticity. And its specific effect is that it leads to an adaptation of systems in both brain and behavior. So there are indeed many experiences that lead to neuroplasticity, and I would like to add a new one, bilingualism. And I thank you very much. I thank my lab members, who I now meet only in little rectangles on a flat screen, and the sources that have generously funded me for this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was a wonderful lecture. There are a few questions. People are very excited. If you don't mind answering a few of them. So let's start with the question posed by Maria Gabriela. She says, in the DRM false memory paradigm, do you think working memory also plays a role? Like, for instance, by maintaining trained words accessible beyond attentional control?
Right. Well, it's certainly a possibility. Maybe they just have different working memory. But I think we can rule that out because we get lots of data from that task. I just showed you a couple of the data points. On everything else we measure, how many of the studied words do they get right? The groups are the same. How many of the words that weren't on the original list do they realize were not on the list and correctly reject? There's no group differences, and so on and so on. So it is a working memory task, but on every single measure except critical lures, the two groups are equivalent. So it's only when we have this sort of conflict that's created by, sweet, that sounds familiar, it was activated, but you have to be able to say, but it wasn't there.
Okay, in the studies in which you mentioned socioeconomic status, how was this construct conceptualized and measured?
How was socioeconomic status?
Yes, measured. How do you normally measure
Okay,
That,
now the two studies I've shown you were not my studies. The Hartanto study, the data came from a very large database. That's how they could have 18,000 plus children in the study. And so this is an online database that includes lots and lots of information. It includes information about income, education, neighborhood. There's a whole pile of stuff, indices that go in. And on that study, they have a very wide spectrum from very, very disadvantaged to, very advantaged. I think the brain study by Natalie Brito used a similar kind of metric. So my understanding is that in both of those studies, they use detailed composites that indicate SES. We've also done studies where we look at SES against bilingualism to deconfound them. And we typically use parents' education and neighborhood income. And we get the same results. We get two main effects. There's a main effect of bilingualism. There's a separate main effect of socioeconomic status. They're not confounded. The difference is that in our studies, we have a narrower range of SES. So we never have included children who are at risk because they live in poverty. So it's a narrower spectrum.
okay. There are a few studies that show effects of executive training, right? Do you have any studies, or do you know of any studies that, relate these two, executive function training
there are,
and bilingualism?
Yeah. Right, that's it. And these are good studies because, you have a group of people and then you train them. So there's no confounds. It's the same people, right? And so there are a few studies, and these are nice studies. There's not a lot of them. There's one by the Edinburgh group, Thomas Back and his associates, who trained people in Welsh, and that was good. We did a study a number of years ago where we looked at students enrolled in first year Spanish, and we tested them at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year, and we got some training effects. And we've just completed a study I'm very excited about, but I won't say much about because we're still writing it up. But we trained a group of monolingual older adults on one of those language learning programs that everybody can download. And we made them do this program every day for 16 weeks and trained them at the beginning, at the end. And all I'll say at this point is they got better at these tasks.
That's interesting. When you study executive functions, you find studies relating lots of variables to executive function performance in children, like parental style and cultural background, apart from socioeconomic status and levels of bilingualism, for instance. As you carry out research on the interaction between bilingualism and executive function in children, what variables would you be more worried to take into account?
Okay, this is a really nice question. It's a really important question. And so I'm going to make a couple of just big statements to contextualize it because it does get to an important effect. What we're trying to show in this research is that bilingualism is one of the factors that's able to shape development, and I think that question is really looking at the developmental piece. So I'll talk about development. Bilingualism, a bilingual environment, bilingual experience is one of the factors that can shape development in the ways we're arguing. We've never said it was the only factor. I've already mentioned that SES is gigantically important, but other things are too. Parenting style, temperament, socialization, affect, I think they all matter. Now, I don't have the time left to take up the challenge in this question. What are you going to look at next? I'll just say, I'm not going to be the one that looks at these other things. but they are all important. And if we're truly going to understand development, we need to understand all of these factors. So it's not a zero-sum game. And by arguing that bilingualism has these effects, I'm not saying that other experiences, contexts, or social conditions also could not have such effects.
Of course, yeah. It's a complex issue, right? Yeah. So I'm going to go back to something that you mentioned, details of the bilingual experience, and think about very specific context. When we consider context of bilingual immersion education, for instance, dual language programs, right, immersion programs, in which the child is exposed to the second language only at school, right? What is the threshold regarding this exposure? I mean, what is the necessary amount of exposure and interaction and use for the cognitive effects to appear, right? Under what conditions can you expect bilingualism to show these effects?
So this is the question, and that's why I spent, I think, 3 slides on that point about we don't even know what bilingualism is yet. You know, we don't even know how bilingual you have to be before any of this happens. Or what if you use another language all the time but badly? Or what if you really know a language really well but you only read it? There's so many aspects of bilingual experience that we haven't yet been able to quantify or relate to these kinds of outcomes. So the point about that big spectrum thing, that big black line, is it's also a big black box. And we need to be able to unpack what's going on as we move inevitably towards what we agree is more bilingual, and figuring out what the indices are, what the metrics might be. So there will be thresholds. Maybe someday we'll be able to quantify them, but we're not there yet.
A big discussion that takes place here in Brazil regarding bilingual education is the different kinds of instruction that children have at school if they are only taught to be proficient in the language, in comparison to real bilingual education, in which they are taught academic contents in the language, right? And this, is expected to make a huge difference in terms of not just the level of proficiency that you develop, but also in terms of the cognitive outcomes, right? Yeah. But there aren't many studies investigating this so far, right? So, I mean, the question about the threshold is related to that, not just how much, but what kind.
Well, I think this is, a topic on its own, and I think it's a very important topic. So Canada is a world leader in bilingual education. And it's because in the 1960s, there was this radical group of Anglophone parents who thought, this is a bilingual country. This is a country with official bilingualism. Our kids are learning no French. They never see a French-speaking human being. We got to do something about this. And this is in the middle of the 1960s. And somebody said, I got a great idea. Let's send them to school and not speak English. They go, oh my God. And this is in the context of just getting past that stage where the absolute certain conviction was that bilingualism destroyed children's minds. This was absolutely clear. But maybe it was becoming a little more questionable. So they created the first French immersion programs. So Anglophone children who spoke only English at home, never saw a French-speaking human being, were sent to school from age 5 on, and they only heard French. So there was a lot of research around it at the time. And at first the research was evaluation of the really pressing question, are we destroying our children? Are they going to be okay? So test their English, test their French, and they were fine. That evolved into something much bigger and much more complex. And so bilingual education, which is now a global phenomenon, has many varieties, and you've picked out some of the main differences. How much of the language, used in what contexts, presented in what ways? Is it okay if we only use the other language for the subjects that don't matter, like phys ed and music? I mean, that would be okay, right? These are real questions asked in real bilingual education programs around the world. Mm-hmm. So again, the answer is it's complicated, depends on many things. A lot of kids get through these bilingual education programs completely impervious to the fact that they just learned another language, walk away and never speak that language again. They didn't become bilingual. Others fully embrace it and become bilingual. So reflecting back to an earlier question you asked, it also depends on the kids. Some kids are going to respond to this experience, some kids are not. Is this experience universally appropriate for everyone? I shouldn't say this in public, but I will. It probably isn't. It probably is not the best education model for every child. But it's a viable education model that can at least make some kids bilingual enough, whatever that means.
Yeah, we have questions to be researched for the rest of our lives and much more, right? Never ends. In a recent paper published at Bilingualism, Language and Cognition, Levada and some colleagues have discussed what they call the phantom-like appearance of bilingual effects on cognition.
The what?
The phantom-like.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And according to them, we need to approach these mixed results as multi-causal outcome of several factors, right? Some of them you have mentioned in your lecture. And they also suggest that in order for us to move forward, we should design multi-lab replication studies, focusing on more solid methodologies, right? But they really emphasize the replication part, right? I mean, how important it is to, to be able to replicate results, right? Do you agree with that? Do you think that's a sound suggestion?
Okay, fine. So let me take that apart in a few steps. First, do I think research should be based on sound methods? Of course I do.
Of course.
I'm a scientist.
Yeah.
And you can look at two studies that get different results and say, I see why. Because this study didn't have the right control group, this study didn't use the right tasks. Okay, I understand. Something about the method led to the results, and we can make that judgment by evaluating the method. That's one point. Second, do I believe that results should be replicable? Of course I do. If you can't replicate something, then maybe it was just an accident that you found it. But the real question from that, the real essence of that question is what's called the replicability crisis. To what extent should research be replicated to prove that it's replicable? These are different concepts. Replicated to prove that it's replicable. And here we get into the problem with bilingualism. Because of the immense complexity of deciding who is bilingual, because of the enormous variation in tasks that are used in this research, there are essentially no two studies that are exactly the same. What does that mean? Well, it is argued the solution is you pre-register a study, hand it out to different labs, and let everybody do exactly the same thing. This is science by recipe. You write up the recipe, you hand it out to everybody and say, bake this cake. And to the extent that the cake comes out the same, you say, all right, it's a good recipe, the cake worked, move on. But the cake is never the same. The flour was different, or the butter had been out of the fridge longer, or you put in a teaspoon less of sugar. There's always a difference, even if you're using the same recipe. The recipe model doesn't work for science because the recipe, in the case of extreme complexity, like bilingualism and cognitive outcomes, can never be executed exactly the same. But what happens when a single lab says, okay, I'm going to do an experiment, and I'm not going to print out the recipe. I don't care if you do it or you don't do it, but I'm so sure in my predictions that I'm going to pre-register it so that if I find it, you know it's true. Okay, this is another approach to the crisis. Here's what happens. You do an experiment. And some of the best study, the most important discoveries I've ever made happen this way. You do an experiment, you lay out your predictions, you look at the results and you say, that's not at all what I expected. So either you say, well, the recipe didn't work, I'm not baking that cake again, or you say, what's going on here? And you dig and dig and dig. And it's only through those failures to find your prediction that you can discover something new. Because as I always say, if you knew exactly how an experiment was going to turn out before you did it, you could save yourself a lot of trouble.
Exactly. You wouldn't do it.
Right. So, should research be based on sound methods? Of course. Would it be nice if we could replicate these outcomes? Of course. But let's not get carried away with this failure to replicate and throw out all of this research because the cakes all come out a little bit different.
Right, wonderful answer, yeah. One last final question. Do adults raised in bilingual, multilingual contexts tend to have different outcomes in learning other language than monolinguals?
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's not research I do, but it's research other people do. And I think the answer is yes. I think that the more languages you know, the easier it is to learn additional languages. But again, that's not in my research, but I think that there are studies that support that assumption.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today for this wonderful talk, this wonderful lecture, and for answering our questions. It was a huge pleasure to have you here with us today, and I invite you to say a few final words.
Well, I just want to thank you for this opportunity. We're all stuck at home. My life now takes place in this chair in front of those fake flowers. And it was just a real thrill to be able to engage again in some academic ideas and speak to colleagues around the world. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me to participate.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.